started. So.
All right, well, let me see if this works.
It was resisting me, so.
I think it's working for me.
It says live on YouTube.
All right, you're live. Let me
switch me back to host, and then I can get us ready. Let's hope it stays live.
I'm gonna make you host. I'm gonna get off and Slack you the link.
Thank you very much.
So it is live though now. So even before you hit broadcast, anyone on the YouTube link will see.
But no one can see because it's unlisted. So we're good.
That's right.
So you can still call everybody and prepare. And Miles, one last thing. This thing will automatically record, right? I don't have to set anything else.
The Zoom will?
Yes.
Yeah, you'll be able to see that once you hit broadcast. You should see the record button change to a start and a stop.
I wanted to double check.
Yeah.
And then, hi. So we are now live on YouTube. And Aaron, you have control and you're sharing your slides.
Yep.
Okay. And there we go. Now I'm the host again. So in 5 minutes, we're going to broadcast. I will, once I hit broadcast, I'll actually do that a minute before, a few seconds before. I will then bring all the attendees in to the panel. So you'll suddenly see 1,500 people appear in the attendee list. So,
John, don't forget to send me the YouTube link.
Yep, Miles is slacking it to me as we speak. Here it is.
Maybe just test it first to make sure it's working, but that should be the.
I will check it one more time. Okay. Here it is.
Maybe just test it first to make sure it's working, but that should be the.
I will check it one more time. Okay, now I'm hearing everything repeated, so I'm going to turn it off. Kim, here's the link. All right. That I can close. This goes full screen.
Okay, I'm gonna drop out of here.
Thank you, Miles.
Thanks, guys.
It's 9:56 my time, so in 3 minutes I will broadcast it. I'll be right back. Okay. Okay, everyone, I'm gonna turn on the broadcasting of this. So please enjoy the webinar and have a great morning.
Hello and welcome to today's webcast titled Market Insights Spring Report. I'm Aaron Larson, Executive Editor of Power Magazine. I'll be moderating today's program, during which we'll hear from Renuka Chatterjee, who is Executive Director of System Operations with the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, Kanaan Ogelman, who is Vice President of Commercial Operations with the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, Emily Nelson, who is Executive Vice President with the New York ISO, and Philip Bruick, who is Director of Markets with the Southwest Power Pool. Each of our guests will open by giving a short presentation about the markets they operate in and trends they are seeing in their region. Then we'll move into a Q&A session for the remaining time we have available. I'd like to encourage everyone to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A feature in the Zoom platform. We will try to answer as many as possible during the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you are experiencing any technical difficulty, you can ask for help by typing the problem in Zoom's chat area, and a member of our production staff will try to assist you in resolving the problem. In addition to using Zoom, we are also live streaming the webcast on YouTube, and we'll be recording it for future viewing on the Power website. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our webinar sponsors, Aggreko and GE Digital.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. Aggreko is a proud sponsor of this webinar, which will be discussing business continuity planning, grid reliability, this pandemic, and the economy. Aggreko knows these are challenging times as more scrutiny is placed on utilities to complete projects quicker, deploy capital more efficiently, and to maintain continuity of service. Aggreko helps keep the lights on for your customers while you achieve these objectives. For more information, visit aggreko.com or email us at utilities@aggreko.com. Thank you.
GE Digital provides asset and operations performance management and remote operations software solutions to leading power generators across the globe. Learn more at ge.com/digital. With that, I'll turn the program over to our first speaker, Renuka Chatterjee. Take it away, Renuka.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you hear me okay?
Coming through loud and clear.
All right. I appreciated the opportunity to speak with you all this morning about an important topic of where we are headed. Without much further ado, if you can move me to slide 1, which you have. So this slide represents the change in the MISO region's generation fleet. It shows the change that has occurred over the last 15 years and where we are headed over the next 15 years. As you can see, we've moved from predominantly coal to more renewables and gas as we stand today. And looking into the future further, we expect that trend to continue. The 2030 generation mix was compiled from a variety of sources, including integrated resource plans from our members, utility reports. So this was developed as a joint scenario with our members. If you can take me to the next slide. This is a summary of our generation queue. I won't go through everything on the slide, but again, it shows that we have a number of projects that total 70 gigawatts that are in the queue right now, predominantly solar and wind, and we expect this trend to continue. And I wanted to also highlight the orange bar in there, which is kind of small, but it's still significant. It represents our hybrid project. So we are seeing solar bundled with storage also come into our queue. Again, thinking about this generation portfolio evolution and the changing resource mix, this affects all aspects of our operations. It's the planning, markets, as well as real-time operations. If you can take me to the next slide, Aaron. Meanwhile, the traditional controllable resources that we are used to have been retiring over time. If you look at the chart, 2016 was a significant year in terms of retirements of traditional resources. In fact, it's so big, we have a break in scale there that is highlighted by the slanted white bar over the 7,000 megawatts. And we continue to see that trend continue. So this affects not just the changing resource mix itself, which is being supplemented by renewables as well as demand response, but it also changes the power flow patterns on the transmission system. The transmission system has been evolving as well, but we continue to see changes in the real-time operations. If you can take me to the next slide, Aaron. This slide represents 3 different events MISO has experienced over the last 3 years. As you can see, the needs of the region are changing. As the generation fleet has evolved, our congestion patterns have changed, our energy needs have changed across the region. In 2018, we had significant cold weather in the south, which required us to push energy from north to the south. On September 15th, we had unseasonably warm temperatures in the south, and that required us to push some energy from north to south. When you look at the January 31st, 2019, this was the time when we experienced historic cold weather across the United States. And during that time, we experienced significant issues in our north region, which required us to have power flowing from our south to the north region. The important point in all of these events is how far in advance were we able to anticipate these events? What tools did we have in terms of managing the event? And how did we ultimately do in real time? So we were reliable in all 3 situations. We were able to use the tools we had. But as we expect the resource fleet to change, we continue to see these events grow. And as you can see, none of these events are in the summer. So that's an important aspect as well. One of the terms we've been using is all hours matter. And again, when you take it literally, all hours matter. Energy supply and demand has to be balanced every hour, which has always been true. The newer highlight is how we plan for it. So traditionally, we have always planned in a fashion where if you plan for the summer peak, you would be fine throughout the rest of the year. That is no longer true as the resource fleet changes and the congestion pattern changes. So it's how you plan for all of these hours. How do you ensure that if you had a cold front in January 31st, that you're going to be reliable and efficiently reliable, more importantly. Another aspect of thinking about reliability is our traditional N-1 planning criteria. So traditionally, we have thought about if you were secure for losing your next big contingency, be it generator or transmission line, which is called the N-1 criteria. We've always planned that way. As the generation fleet moves into a more renewable sourced pattern, it's not going to be a single largest contingency. We'll have to rethink such criteria going into the future where, for example, on January 31st, the biggest thing we learned was while wind was blowing, many of our wind farms in our regions had cold weather cutouts. So the wind plants had actually shut down. So we didn't actually get the wind we were anticipating. So thinking about it as not as a single largest contingency, but as thinking about it as a fleet and the big events that can happen on the system. So MISO is working on those elements, which creates our reliability imperative. If you can take me to the next slide, Aaron. Many of you have heard about MISO's initiative called Resource Availability and Need, and it focuses on this reliability imperative. The importance of this is members are making decisions right now about future generation fleets. So it's upon MISO and its members to think about the roles and the processes we need to put into place to continue to be the efficient and reliable as well. The pace and scope of this change as well is different across each of our members. I have a slide in a minute that highlights that. What that allows us to do is take advantage of the diversity in the footprint as well. As many of you can see, MISO goes all the way from Manitoba in the north to the Gulf Coast in the south, and we interconnect across the Midwest with various other RTOs, many of you who are on this panel today. And that gives us opportunities to think about a interconnected solution as well for all of our footprint. If you can take me to the next slide, Aaron. So this is a slide where we talked about each of our members could have different portfolios, and they do in fact have different change of pace, where some will expect to continue the current generation mix, and some expect to significantly change and invest in renewables, and some that are planning to go to practically 100% renewables. So we are working with our members on all of those goals. If you can take me to the next slide, Aaron. As many of you are aware, MISO has published its reports, which highlighted 3 different trends: the digitalization, demarginalization, and decentralization. And we've more importantly termed what are called the needs of our footprint, which are availability, flexibility, and visibility. And again, I say our footprint, but they are not just unique to the MISO footprint, they are unique to all of us. As we think about the future, what system attributes are needed to manage reliability and stability? And we have identified these as primarily 3: the availability, flexibility, and visibility. How much of these attributes are needed now and as the system changes? And again, the system isn't changing overnight in one day. The trend is a multi-year trend, as we saw. The current state we are in evolved over the last 15 years. Where must these attributes be located? Again, an important factor in terms of thinking about location. how effective can inverter-based resources be in delivering those attributes versus conventional generation? How do we attract, manage, and compensate these attributes? And again, we always ensure that who benefits pays, and that we are efficiently sharing, trading these attributes, and how do we enable the same? So we must answer these questions to inform the policy and resource investment decisions that are being made right now. And we must also answer these questions in multiple coordinated dimensions: planning, markets, and operations. And our answers must include flexibility as we adapt to these changing fleets and as the technologies change. So that's our reliability imperative. We are focused and working with our members in addressing these same needs. Erin, if you can take me to the final slide. This is our 2020 focus. Sorry, go back one more. My apologies. If you can go back one. Yep, thank you. So this slide kind of shows those reliability needs. We've identified the reliability needs. We continue to work on them. In the planning horizon, we are developing what we call a sub-annual planning, or a planning resource adequacy reform. Many of our members are familiar with this. We're also looking into resource accreditation, and this is big for us. So we expect a resource to show up in real time when we ask them to, be it in 4 hours in advance. We can. The members can tell us the time they need required to be in advance to be notified. But once we say we expect the resource, they have to be in. So we have to be able to count on that. That is the accreditation piece. And we are looking at this resource accreditation for all of our resources, including demand response. We're also looking at scarcity pricing reforms. Again, we are looking into the ERCOT experience that they had last summer, and we're trying to learn from it on how it can help us and the region in terms of the ensuring that the right prices signals are sent in real time. If you can take me now to the last slide, Erin. Again, this is a study we performed called Renewable Integration Impact Analysis, or RIA as we all like to call it. And it shows, one of the questions I always get is, what is the inflection point? How much wind can you absorb? It shows that at 30% renewable penetration, we will start to see significant operational risks. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. With that, I will turn it back to you, Erin.
All right. Thank you, Renuka. And Kanan, you're up with the ERCOT report.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. As was said earlier, my name is Kenan Agalman, and I oversee a team that does all the wholesale and retail market settlements, does market design, and runs our CRR, or financial transmission right auction, as well as our day-ahead market. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start off by sharing with you kind of some of the longer term outlook data points. Currently, despite COVID-19 impacts, the ERCOT region is still forecasted to experience load growth in this calendar year. Now, that load growth is going to probably happen differently than we've seen in the past, with probably more growth in the residential area than expected, and probably some less growth, smaller growth in commercial and industrial sectors. We have a new CDR, Capacity Demand Reserve report, coming out tomorrow, but that is not ripe for discussion yet. So as of our last Capacity Demand Reserve report, we are seeing an increase in planning reserves for this summer, where we will have planning reserves at 10.6%. But I would encourage the audience to check our press release tomorrow to see updated numbers going forward. We are still forecasting the possibility that the peak load in this summer will exceed the record set August 2019. Most of the new growth in generation projects that we're seeing that are impacting our forward look are renewable and small flexible gas-fired resources. We are also seeing some storage projects, but that's the primary area of growth. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but here we have the ERCOT mix over the last 3 years based on capacity. Next slide, please. And here we have the mix in terms of energy. I do want to share with you, next slide, please. I do want to share with you, even though the solar component is very small in ERCOT currently, it is expected to grow. That is going to be one of the main renewable sources that are going to grow. And on this slide, the key thing I wanted to share is, so this is a peak day this last August. And what's going to drive pricing and market impacts on a peak day is what we call net load, or load adjusted for intermittent resources such as wind and solar. And as many may know, there's a very high penetration of wind in Texas, in the ERCOT region, but solar is going to kind of change some of the behavior. So if you look at the very bottom, there's a small bar that represents solar, and you can see that when wind is coming down and actually bottoms out, we are at some of our most scarce moments, solar is actually going to help in those hours. Moreover, we expect solar to kind of push out that peak as it grows. So this will be a trend to watch, but we do see solar changing some of the dynamics of our market. We will experience some kind of ramp challenge as solar gets larger and larger, as California has. However, if you look at the wind starts ramping up as solar is ramping down. So there is, unlike California, a little bit more kind of sympathetic or complementary interaction between solar and wind in the ERCOT region. Next slide, please. One of the big things that we are preparing for is battery energy storage and higher levels of distribution level resources. So resources on the distribution system instead of on our transmission system. We are addressing these issues in a program called Passport. And that program is going to address battery energy storage, distributed resources, and incorporate real-time co-optimization into the ERCOT market. All three of these are going to have to work together and are going to require some significant system changes. We expect to deliver that in 2024. That does not mean that we can't digest battery energy storage or distribution level resources. However, a lot of that incorporation means workarounds, especially regarding our system software. And where we want to get is an ideal set of system software functionality that can work with these. Let me spend just a few more minutes on why that's important with batteries or energy storage. Currently, we treat them as kind of a load when they're charging and as a generator when they're discharging. However, items like state of charge are important, and ultimately, we would like our system software to be able to consider all of the parameters of a storage device in the dispatch decision, instead of us at times making it look like load and at other times making it look like generation. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide now, please. As far as distribution resources go, the pricing for the distribution resources are different, and ERCOT doesn't have as much visibility into the distribution system. We aren't necessarily interested in managing the distribution system the same way as we do the transmission system. We are interested in partnering up with our transmission and distribution provider allies. But we do want to send the right price signal. Currently, a lot of these resources get what is the zonal price signal that does not reflect congestion or other reliability needs. So we are moving to a nodal pricing system for distribution level resources. And we are working on finding ways to allow distribution level resources to also provide ancillary services. So some of the challenges that we're going to face as the system incorporates more and more intermittent resources such as solar and wind is maintaining reliability. And we need to allow both distribution level resources and transmission level resources to provide those reliability services, which we call ancillary services. That means that we need to understand if they're deliverable on the distribution system and that we are pricing those accordingly. Next slide, please. Lastly, I just wanted to share an update with the guests about the impacts of COVID-19 that we're seeing. So we've been performing weekly analyses on load impact as a result of COVID-19, and the results are varied, and past analysis isn't necessarily the best indicator of future conditions. And one reason for that is that the state restrictions are changing in Texas. So what we saw in the past may be very different than what we see in the future. But what we've seen is that as far as the peaks go, it's been varied. There's been no impact in some days and a decrease between 2 and 5% on other days. As far as energy usage, we've generally seen a decrease between 2 and 5%. Again, you can track our weekly analyses on our website under our news and outreach area. And if we go to the last slide, that'll show kind of how you can access the ERCOT.com website through various means. And with that, I'll stop and let the next presenter go forward.
All right, thank you. And Emily Nelson, Executive Vice President with New York ISO is next.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all doing well today. I'd like to provide some insights both on the longer term trends that we're experiencing in the state of New York, as well as spend some time talking about recent events and how the pandemic is impacting our operation and the overall system operation. So with that, if we could move ahead. So the New York ISO has several core aspects of our mission, certainly maintaining regional reliability, operating the competitive wholesale markets, planning the system for the future, and acting as an authoritative source of information. So next slide, please. When we think about some of the changes that are underway across the power system, planning is more important than ever. And we have several efforts this year that are really focused on informing what the power system of the future will look like in New York, given several of the policy objectives we have in the state, some of the resource changes we're anticipating. So please pay attention to some of our information throughout the year of 2020. We have a congestion assessment, which is very meaningful, that is coming out in the next few weeks. We are doing a climate study, which is really looking at the power grid out to 2040. And we have our reliability needs assessment, which looks out to the time frame of 2030. All of that information on the planning side helps inform what to anticipate on the power grid, and that informs our market structure and our market design. So within New York, we have an installed capacity market, which supports resource adequacy. Unlike some of the other areas, our capacity market focuses on a seasonal time frame, as well as having monthly auctions. So it is not the longer term 3-year ahead market that you see in certain other areas. The capacity market works in conjunction with our energy and ancillary services market, and that helps support our operations reliability mission. So next slide, please. For quite some time, emission reductions has been a focus in New York. So together with the competitive markets and the policies that the state has set, along with some of the changes in technology and fuel supplies, we've seen significant reductions really across the board with respect to emissions. So carbon dioxide emissions have reduced 51% over roughly a 20-year period, and we see even more substantial reductions across NOx and SOx. There's much more to do in this area, and I will cover some of the very specific policy goals we have for the state in a future slide. Next slide, please. One of the specific challenges we have within New York is that much of our zero emission resources are located upstate. And that is predominantly at this point wind. Certainly our hydroelectric facilities, everyone's familiar with the Niagara Generation Station. And we have much of our nuclear fleet located upstate. With respect to demand, that is really focused in and around the New York City metropolitan area. So of course, the challenge is connecting this zero emission resource capability with the demand that is located downstate across a transmission system, which is very much limited at times. So as you can imagine, thinking about how to evolve the transmission grid through different public policy initiatives is very much a focus within the state. We see potential curtailments of renewable energy really expanding if we're not able to invest in the transmission system and help connect the supply with the demand going forward. Next slide, please. Looking at some of the impacts on our demand profile, we are very much a summer peaking system. And you'll see from the graphic included in the presentation here that our record peak was in 2013. It was just shy of 34,000 megawatts. In New York, we experience peak demand when we have a prolonged period of hot weather, which is really driving AC load. And that pattern has not yet changed. Certainly, it's becoming more complex to manage power system operations. There's a variety of conditions that need to be managed, including extreme cold and some of the variability that's being introduced with intermittence. That being said, we still are a summer peaking system, and for the upcoming years, we expect that to remain the same. Next slide, please. One variable which is changing our demand profile is the adoption of electric vehicles. And with some of the very specific policy goals that are in place for transforming not only the electric sector, but the transportation sector and the building stock, it'll be interesting to see how electric vehicle demand really drives not only our peak demand, as you can see here on the turquoise colored line, we're expecting our peak to shift quite a bit based off of the adoption of EVs, but it'll also drive our overall energy usage that we're experiencing across the state. Looking out to 2030, we're seeing that in the summer, EVs may drive an increase in peak demands of about 400 megawatts, and in winter, where the charging may be more coincident with our peak hours, we're seeing increases of 650 megawatts. The amount of energy usage that EVs may contribute to transforms more substantially when you look out to the 2040 timeframe. And again, that ties back to some of the policy initiatives we have in the state. Next slide, please. So let me spend a moment more at a macro view about some of the transition that we as an ISO are managing here in the state. New York has very substantial decarbonization policies, and similar to some of the other panelists here, it's very interesting to think about some of the reliability challenges that transition requires us to contemplate. So certainly thinking about having sufficient supply across the day and across the season to meet the demand is critical. Thinking about the reserve needs we have across the system, both from a quick start 10-minute perspective as well as maintaining our 30-minute reserve supply is absolutely critical for us. When we consider the transmission system and making sure that we're meeting all of the operations criteria to maintain a secure transmission system, this can be more challenging given the intermittent nature of some of the resources that we're interconnecting. So this and many other questions are certainly forefront in our mind, and thinking through how the reliability needs will drive market evolution to support fulfilling that objective. On the next slide, if you could move ahead, you'll see some more information, certainly very high level, on the very specific Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed by the New York State Legislature and signed into law by Governor Cuomo last year. And within this legislation, you'll see that by 2030, the objective is to achieve 70% of our energy production through renewables. And then by 2040, having 100% of our electric needs served by emissions-free resources. There are very specific resource targets which provide the basis to achieve some of these goals. One substantial change is the anticipation of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Solar energy will continue to increase up to 6,000 megawatts by 2025. And introducing more storage, 3,000 megawatts by 2030. So with these resource targets, you can also compare where we're headed to where we currently are. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the 2018 production that really supplied New York's needs. And you'll see that roughly 39% of our production in 2018 came from fossil-based resources. So there is some work to do to achieve these ultimate policy goals. Next slide, please. How do we achieve this vision and really meet the objectives that we've set forth as a state? Certainly the NYISO sees the wholesale markets as a very critical element to achieving these objectives. So through the markets, you will incent not only existing technologies that are available, but also encourage innovation. One way that we're thinking about providing some of these incentives through our markets are through innovative ideas such as carbon pricing. So we've worked through with stakeholders the concept of including a very specific carbon price as part of the development of our LBMP. And we see that as an example of an idea that really supports the broader vision that we have for the state. In addition, we are pursuing changes across our energy and ancillary services platform, thinking about many of those reliability needs I just recently mentioned. Do we have the right incentives in place to really make sure our reserve needs across the state are supported, and that we are providing correct incentives to encourage the attributes that really will be necessary to maintain a reliable grid going forward. So moving to the next slide. Much of what's included in this slide I just covered in my comments, but I will add that the way that we maintain resource adequacy is also a very important element of maintaining reliability. So considering how our resource adequacy models need to evolve to incorporate factors to a greater extent that represent load forecast uncertainty, as well as some of the very specific transmission security issues that we need to maintain, are certainly questions that we're working through with the New York State Reliability Council and with our stakeholders to make sure that our fundamental structure for resource adequacy supports the overall objectives. Next slide, please. So shifting a little bit from the broader sweep of how the power system is evolving to more near-term impacts that we've experienced with respect to the pandemic, it is certainly interesting to offer some insights in this area. New York has been very much the center of the pandemic, really worldwide at this point, unfortunately. With respect to the New York ISO specifically, we certainly saw that continuing to be able to provide our critical services with respect to reliability and continuing to operate our markets as very important to provide some sense of stability in a way that we can contribute in very uncertain times. With that in mind, and as we were seeing some of the projections really in trying to translate that to what it would mean to our operation, we fairly early on decided that we needed to sequester a fairly substantial amount of our grid operations staff. So a 37-person team of volunteers, primarily system operators, but also supported by facilities and also food services, was sequestered on March 23rd. We were fortunate in working with the government. We were able to actually perform some testing of all of these individuals before we sequestered them. And that was a very important step to ensure that in moving to a sequestered state, we would be protecting health, not really introducing a increased risk type of environment. So this 37 person team was really divided across our two facilities, and we set up fairly quickly the lodging on site, the food support, all of those things that really are necessary to support people in order to fulfill their work going forward. Effective May 4th, we were able to continue the sequestration, but with a reduced team of 19 people located on one site. And this has been a very interesting experience, certainly. New York has been devastated, obviously, by the coronavirus. In the capital region, the impacts have been lesser, of course, as compared to the New York City metropolitan area. We have had roughly 3,000 cases within the capital region, and in comparison across New York State, as of yesterday, we've had 337,000 cases and over 21,000 deaths. So absolutely devastating. If you go to the next slide, you'll see much more from an analytical perspective, the impact on the load, which is certainly interesting from a power system operations perspective. We have seen reduced demand. Interestingly, in New York City, The reduction in demand at times was about 20% below what we typically see. We've seen shifts in commercial demand as many of the office buildings have been closed down, and increased residential demand as people shelter in place and work from home. Overall, looking across NICA, we see approximately an 8% reduction in peaks. And it's interesting to try to forecast what this will mean for our summer operations. Quite frankly, it's hard to tell. We're starting certain phases across the state of reopening the economy. Not surprisingly, this is really more upstate at this point. So trying to put together how the reopening might dovetail with summer behavior across the commercial and residential sectors, and certainly anticipating what weather we might experience, all needs to come together to really drive our peak demand. And certainly the situation is very fluid and dynamic at this point. With all of that said, as a lifelong New Yorker, I'm really proud of how the state has pulled together. Happy that the NYSO could support in one small way the continued operation of the state. And I hope everyone stays well. And I think that concludes my slides. And you'll see our website, nyso.com, for more information. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Emily. And our hearts do go out to everyone in New York, because I know you are really the heart of this pandemic and dealing with a lot up there. So we're thinking of you all the time.
Appreciate that.
All right, Philip. Philip
All right,
Bruick.
good morning. I'm Philip Bruick, Director of Market Administration with SPP. Next slide, please. All right, these are our two footprints. We have a presence in both the Eastern Interconnection and the Western Interconnection. The area to the right in gray, that's our RTO footprint. We're in all or parts of 14 states, spanning all the way to the Canadian border in the north, and then down to the south, the panhandle of Texas, and then parts of New Mexico and Louisiana. And then the area to the left in gold or to the west, that's our presence in the Western Interconnection. In December of 2019, we began providing reliability coordination services for this portion of the Western Interconnection. And then we're currently also developing an energy imbalance market for part of the Western Interconnection. And I've got a slide later to provide you some more details on that. So next slide, please. All right, this is our fuel mix, energy production for 2019 by fuel type. You can see it's a fairly diverse fuel mix, pretty well balanced. Coal provided about a little over a third of our energy production in 2019. Natural gas and wind provided a little over a fourth of the energy production. And then we have much smaller amounts for nuclear, hydro, and other fuel types. So I want to contrast this slide, which is energy production by fuel type, with the next slide, which is our nameplate capacity. So this is nameplate capacity as of the first of the year, and you'll see there's a bit of a shift in the fuel mix, particularly between natural gas and coal, whereas on the previous slide, coal was providing about a third of our energy production. It represents just about a fourth of our nameplate capacity. And then natural gas is the biggest component of our fuel mix at 41%, but it only provided a little over a fourth of our energy production. And then wind is about the same, be it nameplate capacity or energy production. It's a little over a fourth, and again, much smaller amounts for nuclear, hydro, and others. And then in our generation interconnection queue, wind has grown significantly over the past few years, but now we're seeing more and more solar and energy storage come in as well. So next slide, please. All right, so wind has grown significantly in the past few years. SPP is known as the Saudi Arabia of wind based on the unique geographic location of our footprint with all of the higher wind speeds within the United States. But if you go back as recently as 5 years ago, we had about 10 gig of wind online. At this point, we're up over 23 gigs. So in less than 5 years, we've more than doubled our installed wind nameplate capacity. We've seen wind go as high as 18 gig back in January, and then we've seen it go as low as 374 megawatts on an interval last summer. Maximum wind penetration, this is a metric that changes about every other month for us. We keep breaking our old records, but as recently as a couple of weeks ago, we saw wind penetration of 73.2%. In other words, wind serving 73% of our load at that time. And if you tack on other renewables with that, like hydro, we were at 78% of renewable penetration. That's quite an amazing feat, getting up that close to 80% for, even though it's a peak penetration, that's a fairly high number. And I can remember going back as recently as 4 years ago, there was concern among our staff and some of our stakeholders that if we ever hit over 50% of maximum renewable penetration, there were going to be some concerns. Fortunately, we've been able to accommodate that to these current levels, which again, for maximum penetration, have gotten us close to 80%. And even on the average, we saw in 2019, where on the average for the year, wind served almost 29% of our load. And what we're seeing in 2020 is that's, of course, continuing to increase. We're averaging around 30% at this point of average wind penetration. Next slide, please. And so these are some of the challenges we've seen with wind, or the swings. This is the day back in December 11, where we saw almost 18 gig of wind power serving just over half of our load. And less than a day later, 21 hours later, then wind dropped to just 6% of our generation mix. But then the other conventional resources like coal and gas ramped up to cover that difference. And so this is just a great illustration of the value of having a diverse fuel mix between renewables and conventional generation to accommodate a wide variety of different operational circumstances. So next slide, please. All right, I mentioned earlier our presence in the Western Interconnection. We've already implemented reliability coordination services. We're a few months into that. We're also developing a Western Energy Imbalance Market that will go live February of 21, just under 9 months away. We've had 8 utilities sign contracts as market participants. There is no requirement for RTO membership for that. And then this is very similar to our history, our legacy of an EIS market that we initially started with back in 2007 that we operated for 7 years for our Eastern Interconnection, where it was more of an evolutionary approach of getting our market participants used to operating in a market. And then they quickly saw the value in that and the financial reward. And then by 2014, we implemented a fully integrated market with day-ahead real-time congestion hedging, virtual trading, et cetera. And so we expect to see the same results in the West as well, taking a gradual approach initially with an energy imbalance market. The participants involved will see value in that, and then that will lead to other opportunities for expanded markets. So next slide, please. All right, so COVID-19, hard to believe we're about 9 weeks into this if you're counting, but starting back in about mid-March, we all began operating as we do today, working remotely and seeing each other through computer screens. And I put this slide in here just to give an idea of what that's meant in terms of WebEx meetings like this. Just for the month, I had close to 4,000 WebEx meetings. 15% of those were stakeholders for our various working groups, committees, and even our quarterly board meeting that went very well using WebEx. And then about 85% of internal WebEx usage with meetings we used to have face-to-face in conference rooms, we're now doing via WebEx. And again, just for the month of April, if you tallied all that up, that's 32,000 attendees over 170 days. That's almost in 1 month, that's almost a half a year of end-to-end WebExes. So just wanted to throw that out there of how COVID has changed our interaction. Next slide, please. And then from a system operation perspective, we've seen a marked change in our scheduled generation outages. What this slide is indicating, if you look at the different squiggly lines going from over on the left, January through May on the right, those are the scheduled outages going back to 2016, year by year. And then that shaded pink region underneath is this year, 2020, of the scheduled generation outages. You see a drop of about 30% from what we've historically seen once you got to the April and May timeframe. And the real driver for that from our membership is they've indicated it's crew availability, or maybe unavailability is a better way to say it, that when you take an outage, it's the time for the crew to handle the maintenance on that, and not knowing what the COVID numbers were going to look like. And of course, in all areas they had continued to grow. They didn't want to put their crews at risk, and at the same time didn't want to get in the middle of a busy outage season, which you typically see in April and May, and not be able to wrap up the generation outages quickly enough, again, due to some concerns on what crew unavailability might be. Next slide, please. And I'll go through this quickly in the interest of time. But this just further illustration. What I showed you on the previous slide was first of the year through May. This is June through December. And again, we're typically looking at a lot of maintenance in the fall. This is already what's scheduled for the fall, but we're going to have to take those maintenance outages again that we weren't able to do in April and May and shift some of those to the fall as well. So this is going to be a very delicate balancing act going forward. Next slide, please. And there you see the canceled outages again, where the area in pink rises up above what historically we've seen. Next slide, please. All right, so load, seeing load compared the effects of COVID-19 on load. What you're seeing in this graph is the yellow or gold line is what our actual load was starting about mid-March in the COVID timeframe. The shaded areas are statistical data points, representations of like kind temperature days, plus or minus 3 degrees in the past, where you could kind of compare what's going on these days. So the first week in mid-March, we didn't see much of a difference. Then you get to March 20th, and you start seeing that gold line of actual generation, how that begins to drop significantly below what we have statistically seen for like kind type days. And the next slide. And then here's where you really see the difference starting in April of actual load is down significantly over what we have historically seen on the average beginning in late March and in April. We've seen about a 7 to 9% drop in our load. Next slide, please. And I threw this in there for transmission outages as well. The vertical red lines are the total number of transmission outages in the current year, 2020. The other two lines are 2018 and 19, and you can see where the last few weeks that has dropped off significantly for transmission outages for the same reasons I mentioned before. So next slide. I believe that's my last one. So with that, we'll turn it back over.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get this back into a gallery view where we can all get on the screen together. And we've had a lot of questions come up. Thank you all for your presentations. They were all very informative and very interesting. And because our presentations did go a little longer than we had anticipated, I'm going to ask that you all stick around for maybe 10 or 15 more minutes so we can get through at least some of the questions and answer some of these things. So without further ado, let's jump right in. How do you plan to maintain reliability when significant percentages of power are from wind and solar, when these sources rarely match peak demands? Would anybody like to kind of address that right off the bat?
I can take that. So we are always going to procure the reserves and ancillary services that we need to procure or to maintain voltage and reliability. We don't have any particular targets or anything like that in ERCOT, but the flip side of that is that we will curtail intermittence if it means taking off a resource that we need to meet our reliability requirements that both we have for ourselves and that NERC assigns to us.
Okay.
I think that's a great answer. Some additional thoughts on it, if I may, is we're also expanding a lot of our capability within the control center. So across many of the ISOs, investing in forecasting tools and capabilities so that the operators have situational awareness and they can anticipate increases or decreases of intermittence. That's also an important piece of maintaining reliability going forward.
And I'll add to that as well. I think the key is having a diverse, balanced fuel mix between conventional generation as well as renewables. And like has already been mentioned in terms of the tools as well, having the tools for the operators and shift engineers, being able to look several hours out to cope with intermittency issues.
All right. Another question here. What are some of the leading energy storage solutions that you see hitting the market? I know you're all seeing energy storage coming into your systems. What are some of the leading ones?
Most of the storage solutions we are seeing actually come paired with solar. It kind of tends to give that balance for what most folks are calling what's called a virtual power plant. I did want to share, we are not seeing as much of storage solution paired with wind. In fact, operationally, I wanted to share an example in December where there was a couple of days with where the wind didn't blow. So we had 39 straight hours of wind at practically zero because wind wasn't blowing. So, you know, battery technology still has some ways to go in terms of catching up to thinking about such extended periods, but we are seeing it a lot with solar in the queue.
Are most of, I guess I would say lithium ion seems to be the battery storage of choice. Do you see anything else starting to come into your systems?
This is Kenan. Certainly, there are some other technologies out there that would I guess, be considered storage, like pumped hydro, or we are also seeing at least some conceptual designs around compressed air storage as well.
Here's another question about coal power, which I know you're all kind of seeing, and actually just yesterday came out a report that it was the lowest in almost 40 years or something like that, that coal supplied last year. So which states do you think will retain coal power until the 2030s? Are there any specifics that are really relying on it and that you think will continue?
Well, I can answer really quickly for New York. We no longer have coal power in the state. So earlier this spring, the last coal plant in the state closed, retired. So certainly New York does not have coal in its future at this point.
And I know with all of the states within the Eastern Interconnection or the Eastern Interconnection component of our RTO footprint, they're all meeting their individual state guidelines for reduction in coal through 2030.
Okay, here's a question specifically for Emily because it relates to Indian Point, the nuclear plant where I believe Unit 2 finally was taken offline now, and Unit 3 will be next year. How is the retirement of Indian Point going to affect downstate New York generation mix?
So Indian Point 2 did shut down just recently here, and in 1 year's time, Indian Point 3 is scheduled to retire. We have seen some new resources come onto the system in that area as well in the Hudson Valley. So most recently, we've had Cricket Valley, which is a gas-fired plant, come into service. We also anticipate that based off of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, that we should see greater amounts of storage, offshore wind and solar coming onto the system. Predominantly what is in our interconnection queue are intermittence and storage. So we anticipate that is where our primary increase in energy supply will come from in the upcoming years.
Okay, thank you. Kanan, this one is specifically for you. Has ERCOT modeled the ESR charging and find any local constraints due to transmission reliabilities?
So, I mean, there are transmission constraints, charging or additional load. There are places, if you look at charging a battery as more load, we have constraints out in West Texas where charging would be difficult. There could be times in load pockets where charging could be difficult, but this is all dependent on system topology, and system topology is constantly changing as we build more transmission, build more generation, and more load comes on the system. So I just kind of caution you that that's a very transient type of study, and what shows up now might be different in a few years. I do think we are seeing in West Texas in particular, where there hadn't traditionally been a lot of load and there's a lot of solar interest. That area I think is going to take us longer to solve than some other areas are. But again, I think it will be transient, and we do identify those things in our transmission planning studies.
Okay. Philip, this one is directed at you. To what extent are renewable resources curtailed or not dispatchable against loads? Does this represent a growing concern regarding the inefficiencies of installing additional wind or solar capacity?
Yeah, well, I don't have any exact numbers to share on that, but year to year, we have seen reductions in the amount of wind that we've had to curtail. You know, one thing that has helped considerably has been we've had a tremendous build out of our transmission grid over the last 12 years or so. Our stakeholders have invested about 10 to $12 billion in upgrading the transmission grid. And so that's helped with wind as well. We still do obviously see significant levels of wind curtailment at times, given the amount of wind that's installed on our system. But the other thing to keep in mind is typically your heavier wind is during the off-peak hours, the early morning hours or the late evening hours.
Okay. Here's a question about energy storage again. And to be honest, I'm gonna pose it to you because I'm not sure I understand the question, but energy storage seems to be the next frontier. Why isn't fabric being more widely considered as a viable solution? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I believe fabric's an acronym for something, but I need a little bit more detail on that. I think it's a particular technology, but if the question poser could follow up with that, that might be really helpful. Okay. So it's more concentrated on the building side from, I think there's a, oops, I lost that chat message from Kim, but I think what was flashing on my screen was it's a building concept. So I think that is, again, please help me if I'm on the wrong track, but things like building in a way that has more mass and can carry, like you cool at night and kind of carry that through and use less power during the peak and things like that. I mean, certainly those things are possible, and actually that is being discussed to some extent by several professors at the University of Texas, and there is some analysis being done at the University of Texas on this. But what I guess my kind of answer would be, the key thing for me is to get the incentives right so that whatever technology people want to bring in are in place, and probably on a commercial and residential level, time of use rates, their relative lack of penetration into the market, I think is holding those types of things back.
Resilience events are longer outages. How are the ISOs addressing black swan events? Kind of, I guess, one-off type events. Anyone want to try to tackle that?
Hi, I'm happy to. This is Emily. So one thing in considering resiliency and sort of extreme situations, you have to build that into your modeling. So I think during my prepared comments, I mentioned the resource adequacy models and trying to include uncertainty. As you have, for example, more intermittence coming on the system, you need to make sure that you expand your modeling to reflect periods where they may be unavailable. Similarly, several years ago, many of the ISOs were focused on the polar vortex. I was really surprised that over Mother's Day weekend, I was seeing headlines about a polar vortex in May, but much more extreme situation in the winter timeframe. And that caused a lot of the ISOs to contemplate, do we have the right performance metrics embedded in how resources are compensated? So I think as your view of the system changes and sort of the extremities that you need to prepare for evolves, then you build that into your modeling and really make sure that you're incenting the attributes you need to manage the grid. So thanks.
Okay. Well, I know you all have jobs to do, and you've been very generous with your time already. So I think at this point we'll close the webinar. And for one last thing I'd like to do is, again, thank our sponsors, Greco and GE Digital, for co-sponsoring today's event. And I'd like to thank all the attendees who signed in, and I hope the presentations were all beneficial to you, and thank you for asking questions. We'll try to answer some that we didn't get to via email. But with that, I think we'll close the program. And again, thank you, speakers, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Stay safe.